regardless of the political consequence, and what are we spending and what are we getting for our money? So I came at this from the standpoint of half of what we spend on law enforcement, the courts, and the prisons is drug-related. About $70 billion a year. And what are we getting for that $70 billion a year? We're arresting 1.8 million people a year in this country. I point out that's the population of New Mexico that gets arrested in this country every single year. And trying to put a face on those 1.8 million arrests. You know, we have this notion that we've gotten a little bit more pragmatic when it comes to drug laws. We have this notion that, gee, people aren't really getting arrested anymore for possession only, that we're really compassionate, we're prioritizing and we're not doing this when in fact we are doing this. So I'm meeting with this fellow 3 weeks ago in Des Moines, Iowa. This is a young man who, you know what, he's anything but a criminal. I'm talking with him, and he tells me that he was arrested and charged with possession of 1 gram of marijuana with intent to distribute it to his 17-year-old daughter. Now, you know what? That's a laugher, but it's not a laugher. Because here's the reality. He got convicted and sentenced to 25 years in jail. He had just ended up spending 14 months in jail, and he had been released on parole, of which he was going to spend the next decade of his life on parole, reporting to a parole officer. This is the reality of those 1.8 million arrests. And there are now 30 million Americans in this country that have been subject to the criminal justice system that, but for our drug laws, would otherwise be tax-paying, law-abiding citizens. So in 1999, I just said, hey, I want to look at this issue, I want to examine this issue, and I want to include legalization as a potential alternative. So what I needed to do was start with Holland. And this was in 1999, and what the government had to say regarding Holland was, Holland has skyrocketing drug use, and they have crime that's out the roof. It's a terrible place to live, and it all has to do with the fact that they have effectively decriminalized the use of all drugs. Well, it took about 30 minutes of examination, and it took days to actually verify it, but it took about 30 minutes to recognize that Holland has 60% the drug use is that of the United States. That's on a per capita basis. But that's kids, that's adults, and that's marijuana, and that's hard drugs. So gee, that really doesn't pan out. And then do you know that 10 years ago, Portugal decriminalized the use of all drugs in Portugal? And today they are showing a 50% reduction in heroin use over the last 10 years, and they've decriminalized the use of all drugs. So this is, of course, quite contrary. And then there was the notion that marijuana was a gateway drug. Well, this is what I had to contend with. Now, I don't drink alcohol, but I've drank alcohol. I don't smoke marijuana, but I've smoked marijuana. And in my opinion, in no way was marijuana a gateway drug. In my opinion, people that used heroin smoked marijuana just like alcoholics drank milk. That was my opinion. Now, that was my opinion, but I better find out what's been said about this scientifically. What has been said about this study-wise? Well, it turns out that the government itself has done an extensive study and come to the conclusion that marijuana is not a gateway drug, and yet the government continues to say that marijuana is a gateway drug. I debated Barry McCaffrey on 60 Minutes when I was governor of New Mexico, and Barry McCaffrey maintained that marijuana was in fact a gateway drug when it's not a gateway drug. So after looking at this issue for a fairly short amount of time, because there's just not all that much out there, but what's out there presents overwhelming evidence that 90% of the drug problem is prohibition related, not use-related, and that is not to discount the problems with use and abuse, but that ought to be the focus. So after examining this problem, I came to the conclusion early on and stated it in 1999 and continue to state it to this day, that marijuana should be legal. And when I say legalize marijuana, it is never going to be legal to smoke pot, become impaired, get behind the wheel of a car. It's never going to be legal to smoke pot, become impaired, do harm to others. It's never going to be legal for kids to smoke pot. And regarding all the other drugs, that I would advocate harm reduction strategies, reducing death, disease, crime, corruption, the things that we really care about. Looking at all drugs from the standpoint of them being a health issue first, rather than a criminal justice issue. And what are some harm reduction strategies? Well, do you realize that Zurich, Switzerland gives out free heroin? They have a heroin maintenance program in Zurich, Switzerland. If you live in Zurich and you're a heroin addict, you can get a prescription for heroin and get free heroin at a heroin clinic. The idea was that death was going to be reduced because the heroin was going to be a dose that wasn't going to cause an overdose. It was going to be a safe heroin dose. There wasn't going to be any more disease because there were going to be clean needles issued at the clinic. No more hepatitis C, no more HIV, no more real crime. You were going to have to rob and steal to pay for your heroin. Women weren't going to have to be involved in prostitution. You're going to take the guns and violence out of drugs, so that was going to be significantly decreased. I met with the chief of police from Zurich who came to Albuquerque for a drug conference. He said when they came out with heroin maintenance in Zurich, Switzerland, I'm the chief of police in Zurich. I could not have been more opposed to them doing that. All my friends in law enforcement, we all could not have been more opposed to these harm reduction strategies. He said, I'm here in Albuquerque today to tell you that Zurich is a much better place to live today as a result of this maintenance program. We have the most program in the world. That's what sitting a heroin addict stays an addict for quits 15 years because they see overdose or end up in prison. So that is a harm reduction strategy. Understand that prohibition is the issue. I had a publisher of a major American magazine while I was governor tell me, I smoked marijuana in college, he said. And when I smoked that marijuana, I walked into a grocery store, roaches on hands came alive, and you want to realize this? I pointed exactly. That was prohibition. Quality, quantity, unknown. You wanted to smoke a little beer weed, and you smoked some LSD weed. Label this stuff, control it, regulate it, tax it. This is an issue that really has defied logic. Prohibition is the issue. I met with judges in Portland, Oregon. They wanted to meet with me. This was as governor of New Mexico. Well, what was this meeting going to be like? District judges, Portland, Oregon. Well, there were about 6 of them. And what they said was, hey, what you're saying is right on. We are here to support you in what you are saying out there. We would like to share with you, though, anecdotally, some stories that maybe you can pass on to others, that others might better understand the drug issue. They said methamphetamine is really the boogeyman drug. Methamphetamine is the drug that when people take methamphetamine, their behavior really is altered, and not for the better. They do bad things. They do bad things under the influence of methamphetamine. What they said was, look, we're not suggesting the following, but if cocaine were legal, these people would be using cocaine and not methamphetamine. It is the best example of a prohibition drug that we can possibly think of. Methamphetamine, these are the judges talking, methamphetamine would not exist but for prohibition. Cheap, easy to make, so the consequences of methamphetamine disparagingly fall on the poor because it is cheap and easy to make. And so the sentences we see with regard to methamphetamine always are the hardest sentences regarding methamphetamine also. Legalize cocaine, and these people would be using cocaine instead. Well, now let's get to truth and the government. What are the effects of using cocaine? Well, cocaine doesn't have that behavioral altering characteristic, but cocaine really is a dangerous drug in that it puts holes in your heart. I mean, for those people that I grew up with that have used cocaine their entire lives, most of them, having used cocaine their entire lives, aren't alive anymore. They've died from heart attacks. Cocaine literally puts holes in your heart. And for a second, talk about LSD, quality, quantity, unknown. You know that a dose of window pane acid, this is when I was growing up, a dose of window pane acid was the size of a pinhead. That was the dose size. Well, in the mid-60s, there were people taking window pane sheets of window pane acid in the 60s. Quality, quantity, unknown. They were taking sheets of window pane acid and they were jumping out of windows, you know, to their deaths. This was prohibition happening. And talking about LSD for a second. Do you all know Doc Ellis, the major league pitcher in the mid-60s? This is dating myself. Doc Ellis pitched a no-hitter in the major leagues under the influence of LSD. Where does that come from? Where does that come from? Well, now this is Doc Ellis admitting this in his memoirs, and this is 60 Minutes doing an interview. And what they ask Doc Ellis, well, what did you think under the influence of LSD? He said everything was in slow motion. The batters were in slow motion. The catcher's mitt was this big. I was throwing slow motion balls. It was really easy to throw strikes. They were interviewing batters and the catcher. He was throwing BBs all night long. We couldn't even see the ball to hit it. Well, truth, when it comes to the government, truth would go a long ways in this whole topic. So, fast forward. I get out of office January 1 of 2002. I was term limited. I'm a firm believer in term limits. I think as a result of term limits, I think politicians do good things for all of us, as opposed to whatever it takes to get reelected. So I was out of office. I didn't want to have a say in what was happening nationally. I didn't want to have a say in what was happening in the state of New Mexico, because really, I had my shot. I really felt like I made the most out of that shot. But I find myself outraged about 16 months ago over the fact that this country is bankrupt. The fact that 43 cents out of every dollar that we're spending is borrowed. I really think that the world might be on the verge of an economic collapse. It'll be completely unanticipated, and here's how that might happen. A country comes to, like Portugal, like Greece, comes to market with its debt, and nobody buys that debt. The next day, interest rates go up a little bit so that more people will want to buy that debt, and nobody buys that debt. And all of a sudden, the world financial markets are in a jitter, and a country's debt is called into question. The United States, $100 trillion in unfunded entitlement liability.